Hello everybody, my name's Tom Huskinson and I'm going to talk you through a push-to-web mode trial that my colleague Galini, Pantelidou and I at Ipsos Mori carried out for the Department for Education in England. And the overarching aim of this work was to test how a push-to-web approach measured up against an equivalent gold standard face-to-face survey in terms of both response rates and data accuracy. So I'm going to talk you through some background, the methodology we used, the results we got, and I'll finish off by looking at some of the conclusions that we can draw from this research. So starting off with the background, the face-to-face survey on which this is based is called the Childcare and Early Years Survey of Parents, and it's sponsored by the Department for Education and aims to measure children and families' use of childcare and after-school activities. So around 6,000 parents are interviewed and it uses a random probability sampling approach, sampling from the Child Benefit Register. It's got a good response rate, it gets consistently over 50%, and the questionnaire is about 45 minutes. It's a complex questionnaire. And the survey is widely used across government, academia, think tanks and other organisations, and the survey is designated as an official statistic. Just some examples of some of the outputs. Here's a screenshot of the report. Many tables are produced, and here's an example of some media pickup in the Times educational supplement. The Department for Education asked us to carry out a push-to-web mode trial to see to what extent we might be able to move from face-to-face to online interviewing. And this is where you use an offline approach, usually in letter, to push people to respond online. So our overall aim was to test the optimal design of a push-to-web survey intended to produce survey estimates to complement or even replace those provided by the face-to-face survey. And we wanted to design appropriate questions, see how we can maximise response rates and compare data between this and the face-to-face survey. So the first challenge we had was how to design the online questionnaire. One option would just be to try to shoehorn the existing face-to-face questionnaire into an online format, even though it's very long and complicated. Or alternatively, we could try and design a mobile-first questionnaire suitable for mobile completion, kind of building it again from the ground up, but also trying to retain some face-to-face questions to make data comparisons between the modes. So we chose the second of those two options, and to give a couple of examples of the differences in the questionnaires. In the face-to-face survey, we start with a household grid where interviewer records the first name, sex and date of birth of every person in the household and their relationship to the respondent. And the interviewer has to identify which child in the household matches the sample child from the Child Benefit Register. In the push-to-web approach, instead, we just, as the first question, asked parents to confirm that the sample child was living in their household, didn't ask them to give us any personal data. And then we asked just the parents to tell us how many other children they had and their ages and whether they lived with a partner or spouse. Another example is how we recorded the use of childcare. So in the face-to-face survey, interviewers first have to identify the reference week, which is the most recently elapsed term time week. It's usually the last week, but could be 2 or 3 weeks ago. And then after that, the parent says which providers their child has used, if any, in that week. For the push-to-web one, instead of trying to identify a reference week, we just ask parents to think about a typical term time week. And we also reduce the number of response codes. So the preschool formal providers we just changed to nursery or preschool. And we had a separate question to look at use of informal providers like grandparents and friends and neighbours. So really we're just trying to simplify the questionnaire, make it easy for people to respond to, whilst trying to minimise the amount of data we'd lose out on. So in terms of the experimental design, we identified 3 factors to vary experimentally: incentivisation, whether or not a leaflet is included with the invitation letter, and how long the survey was. So looking at incentivisation, we had 3 conditions. The first condition was a £5 electronic gift voucher, conditional on survey completion. The second condition was a tote bag. This was unconditional and included in the invitation mailing. So there it is. It's got a quote there attributed to Albert Einstein, play is the highest form of research. The third condition was just to have the control, just to have no incentive. In terms of the leaflet, parents would either receive a leaflet alongside the letter in their invitation mailing, or they would not receive a leaflet. And the leaflet gave some additional information over and above that included in the invitation letter. It talked about how the survey had supported parents so far and gave an illustration of the research journey from them being selected to the results helping government to improve services. And the final factor we varied was the survey length. So the survey letter told parents that the survey would either take around 15 minutes or around 20 minutes. And parents in the 20-minute condition got an additional battery of questions about home learning activities just to make this condition longer. We used a full factorial experimental design with the treatments fully crossed against each other. So that gave us 12 experimental conditions that you can see here. And we sampled just under 18,000 parents in total. And from this, we wanted to get around 2,000 completed interviews or more. So this design gave us enough power to detect differences of around about 2 percentage points between the various conditions within each treatment. In terms of the survey materials, there were 3 mailings in total. First was the invitation letter for everybody. Then there was a reminder letter for non-respondents. And finally, those who still haven't completed it received a reminder postcard. So let's now look at the results and have a look at the response rates. Around 17% of addresses accessed the survey, so they logged in, and around 15% completed the survey. This may seem a little low, but we do know that around 20% of addresses on the Child Benefit Register are out of date. So parents would be unlikely to receive the survey, so that should be understood in that context. By device type, we found that getting on for half of completed interviews were done on a smartphone, so that really underscores the importance of having a mobile-first questionnaire design. And here are the response rates by experimental design. So these bars are just showing the 15-minute questionnaire length condition. And you can see a strong effect of the incentive with the £5 gift voucher doing the best. Doesn't seem to be much going on with the leaflet, which the different coloured bars. And if we now add the 20 minutes condition, we see similar sort of picture. So again, higher response rates for the £5 gift voucher, then the tote bag, then lower for the no incentive. And it's not clear from these left and right sets of bars that the slightly increased length for 20 minutes is making much of a consistent difference to the response rates. So to make some sort of sense of these response rates, we did a regression analysis to isolate the unique contribution of each condition on the response rate. What we found is that for incentivization, the £5 gift voucher increased the response rate by 9 percentage points compared to offering no incentive. And the tote bag increased the response rate by 4 percentage points compared to no incentive. For the leaflet, whether or not a leaflet was contained alongside the letter made no significant difference to the response rate. And for the survey length, whether we told people the survey would take around 15 or 20 minutes, and whether the survey was actually around about those lengths, that made no difference either. So it's only the incentivization that's actually having any sort of significant impact on the response rates. Also, ultimately, the tote bag, it's worth noting that it was a less effective because it was an unconditional incentive. So the tote bag, we had to put it in every single letter in that condition, but the gift voucher was only paid to those completing the survey. So a single tote bag, while a single tote bag including the additional packing and postage costs was cheaper than the £5 incentive gift voucher, there was much more of them we had to send out. So the gift voucher was both cheaper to implement and had a bigger impact on the response rate. So let's now have a look at some of the data. So on the sample profile, we compared the unweighted sample profile of the push to web survey to that of the most recent face-to-face survey, which was the one conducted just 1 year previously. And we looked at how various demographics compared. And because the face-to-face survey has a much higher response rate, we can consider its sample profile to be much closer to reality whilst not being perfect. So we can use this to see how accurate the push to web survey data is. So looking first at the highest qualification, the green bar on the left shows that 31% of parents in the face-to-face survey have an honours degree or above. And the first blue bar is all push to web respondents. So this is showing that the push to web survey is greatly overrepresenting parents with an honours degree or above. Parents responding just tend to have a higher level of education. And if we look at it by condition within the push to web survey, we can find that the administration of the voucher brings it slightly more in line, the proportion, but the tote bag actually makes it worse. It makes it even more unrepresentative. This is the proportion of responding parents who are lone parents who are not working. In the face-to-face survey, it's 11%, and overall for the push-to-web survey, it was much lower, 5.5%. But the voucher brings it slightly more in line with face-to-face, but the tote bag again actually makes things less representative. Looking at household income, among higher income households, we find in the face-to-face survey, 32% of households have a household income of £45,000 or more gross. In the push-to-web survey, it's 42% overall, so we're overrepresenting higher income households. Whether or not you get a voucher doesn't make any difference, but if those parents in the tote bag condition are even more likely to have a high income. For tenure, in the face-to-face survey, 53% of responding parents were owner-occupiers, and push-to-web overrepresented these parents at 64% overall. And the voucher helped bring this more in line with the face-to-face survey, and there was no difference with the tote bag. And looking at the index of multiple deprivation, so these are the proportion of responding households who live in the most deprived quintile of areas in the country. For the face-to-face respondents, this stood at 28%, and for the push-to-web overall, it was 19%. So we're underrepresenting parents living in the more deprived areas. And the voucher didn't make a difference here, but the tote bag actually made things even worse. We were even less likely to get parents living in those most deprived areas. So finally, we looked at how some of the key survey estimates compared between the push-to-web survey and the face-to-face survey. So where the survey is actually giving similar results to questions. And for these analyses, we weighted the push-to-web data to the same population profile data as the face-to-face survey, just so the comparisons could be made on a like-for-like basis. So if there are differences between the push-to-web and the face-to-face survey estimates, it could be due to sample effects arising from the push-to-web sample being biased in certain ways, or it could be due to mode effects, where respondents are answering differently depending on whether it's interviewer administered or self-administered, or it could be a mixture of both of these things. This is children's use of childcare during term time. Face-to-face survey found 51% of children used formal childcare, and this was very similar across the push-to-web mode trial conditions, except for tote, which overestimated it a bit. For informal childcare, so grandparents and so on, the push-to-web mode trial greatly overestimated incidence of using informal childcare. This is parents' awareness of a policy which entitles 3 and 4-year-olds to 3 hours of childcare. We find for the face-to-face survey, 90% of parents are aware of it, and we find very similar proportions across the mode trial conditions. Here we're looking at working parents' agreement with the statement, if I could arrange good quality childcare which was convenient, reliable and affordable, I'd work more hours. For the face-to-face survey, 23% of parents agreed, and we're overestimating that in the mode trial. The agreement levels are much higher. And here parents were asked how they felt about the amount of learning and play activities they do with their child. For the face-to-face survey, about a third, 34%, said I'd like to do more. But for the push-to-web mode trial, the proportions were much higher. People were more likely to say they'd like to do more. So what are the main conclusions we can draw? We found we could get a response rate of up to 23% with the £5 gift card, but this is much lower than the 51% achieved for face-to-face. We found the cash incentive is most effective at maximising response rates. 20-minute survey length was fine, no worse in response rates than 15 minutes. The inclusion of a leaflet didn't make any difference to the response rate. We found that the sample profile was biased towards generally more affluent families. And whilst the cash incentive slightly reduced the level of this bias, the provision of a tote bag actually made things worse. This isn't necessarily the case for all tote bags. We included an Einstein quote on the tote bag. It's possible this was particularly effective in persuading those parents with higher levels of education to take part, and these are the parents who are disproportionately more likely to take part anyway. The survey estimates were accurate for simple, factual and awareness questions, but they tended to be less accurate for questions about attitudes, perceptions and intentions. So that ends the presentation. I hope there was something of interest in there for you, and thank you very much for listening.